Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It could be any time where you are, but at the moment, it's a Sunday morning, a quiet Sunday morning. You know, I've got up this morning hoping that there were no strange plants ambling around my garden because we've been having strange lights in the sky, and anybody who's seen the Day of the Triffids knows what that means. So British people and anyone else who saw them, you know, watch out for the killer, tentacled, herbivorous enemy that could well be out there. Now, those of you who have clicked on this video are going, what are you talking about, Andy? Well, what I'm talking about today on this video is the future for jazz. Does jazz have a future? I'm going to try and get into that. And I haven't planned anything. This was actually motivated by something that John Lydon, aka Johnny Rotten, said. I went to see him live and he was brilliant. And when asked about the albums that influenced punk, he came out with a catalogue of stuff he was listening to. I'm going to go through it now because it was really interesting. He said that he was not listening to the New York Dolls or Patti Smith or the Stooges, you know, any of that stuff, which is always by the critics named as being the influence on John Lydon. No, he was listening to T-Rex and he was listening to Sweet. Glam rock, basically, and there's a lot of glam rock in the Sex Pistols. He was also listening to progressive rock. He actually said that he liked Pink Floyd at this thing, especially the Syd Barrett era, which makes sense. He was a big fan of krautrock. He loved Neu, he loved Kraftwerk, he loved Can. He was a big fan of Van der Graaf Generator, and he took a lot from Peter Hamill in his vocal approach. But then he mentioned jazz, and he said something that stuck in my mind. He said he loves jazz, but not the sort of jazz when people just go through the motions playing what everyone has played before. He said, but something like Bitches Brew by Miles Davis is an absolute work of genius. He also mentioned Trackmass Replica by Captain Beefheart, which has an almost free jazz influence. Now, I think that John Lydon's a genius, and this is why. All the great music forms are successful, I believe, because they are open to everybody. If someone creates a style of music where normal people can express themselves, then that normal voice comes through and we stop hearing just the voice of the elites. So if we take something like jazz, I believe that jazz started out being created by a group of people that were in America, and the X factor there was the black musicians. The black musicians were bringing in a very altered culture because of the unique experience they'd had in America at that time. But rather than being, you know, putting the walls up to everybody around them, you know, it's been being like segregationist and race essentialist and going, we're creating this black music form. They open themselves up to everything around them, including the musicians. So musicians of all sorts of backgrounds were involved in jazz. Elite musicians, street musicians, and jazz beautifully combined all that. And this is true of every style of music that's been a success, at least in the last, 100 years or so. And I believe that fervently. Right, so jazz emerges. It reaches itself out, when the original Dixieland Jazz Band released that single, those records in 1917, jazz then just goes out and it opens itself up to the whole world. And before you know it, jazz has gone all across the world. And what happens then is it starts to become more sophisticated and a new type of virtuosity emerges. And we see that by the late 20s, early 30s. Louis Armstrong has really made jazz a sophisticated art form, and then people like Art Tatum are doing things that no one has ever done before. And that will naturally go towards elitism, right, that we see with the bebop era. And then after the bebop era, jazz stratifies. And it goes two directions. It goes into rock and roll, it goes into the blues, it goes into English music, and you see the foundations of rock music, but it also influenced things like soul, R&B, and then eventually hip-hop. And I think there's a strong argument that the lineage of jazz goes into hip-hop. And this is the importance of this genre to black people. Now, I'm saying this because I pushed back on this, and I've pushed back on it to try and make some points. But here I am now voicing my opinion the other way, is that I believe jazz is an integrated form. I believe black musicians were involved in creating this form that opened everybody up, because they're making the point. They're basically saying, as James Brown did, open up the door and I'll get it myself. That's what they're saying. It invites everybody in. And we see with music, when it does get too elitist, when it does get too much of the voice of the elites, and I don't think bebop was that at all. I think bebop's edge comes from it's still the voice of outsiders. It's the voice of a different generation of black musicians who did not want to work within the confines of minstrelsy, because there's a whole dollop of Louis Armstrong. All those beboppers loved Louis Armstrong. They loved him. You could see the photographs of Miles Davis and all these people meeting, Dizzy Gillespie meeting Louis, and the love that you could see on their face as they meet this man. But Louis Armstrong couldn't help but work within the what's the word? The word popped into me. He could not help but work within the framework of minstrelsy. That's why his gigs are so entertaining. A lot of our entertainment industry is based upon minstrelsy, right? So they reacted against that, and bebop is almost like swing jazz, but it's highly sophisticated, and the minstrel element has been taken away. There's no Cab Calloway gooning anymore. It's very serious. That elitism is very important, but I think in the long term, it's polluted jazz in a certain way, and it works against that thing that jazz has got to open its arms out and to reach people all over the world, including me here in little old England, a few miles south of Birmingham, in the home of heavy metal, Black Sabbath and Led Zeppelin, Judas Priest. That's where I come from, but I love jazz, right? So that's the first thing I want to get across about jazz. Now, the reason why John Lydon's important, because unlike Patti Smith, unlike the Ramones, unlike the Clash, right? He was full-on working class, dirt working class, Irish immigrant in London with no money whatsoever, with living in 2 rooms, ill in hospital, going through a terrible education system, and really experiencing the trauma of being at the bottom of the pile. And when he comes in and joins this sort of cruddy rock band, sort of post-glam, incompetent rock bands, which the Sex Pistols were, he brings in an eloquence from the English literary tradition, from music hall and English comedy, and he puts all that together, right? So when you look at the Sex Pistols, you've got this sort of visceral rocking band. They weren't incompetent, they were as tight as anything. They were a great rock band. But on top of that, you see John Lydon, who is bringing in bits of, Laurence Olivier and Richard III, a little bit of Steptoe, a little bit of Ian Aqualung, a little bit of Peter Hamill, all these things, a little bit of Monty Python, a little bit of Tony Hancock. You can see in his delivery, it's absolute genius. Now, there's people here watching this channel who go, I don't like the Sex Pistols, they can't play. John Lydon brings something else in. It's like he pulls it back so normal people can access rock music. And so you didn't have to have a music degree and to be able to play the guitar like Steve Howe to access this. Now, I love Steve Howe and I like that music. But what John Lydon did, not any of the other punk bands, not the Ramones, not any of them. It was John Lydon who restructured rock so it could be expressive for people at the bottom of the pile, the outsiders, the same types of people that created jazz, right? Creativity is the domain of the outsider. It's the domain of the people who bring in another voice. So, for jazz to have a future, it needs to open its arms and its doors to those people. And I'm afraid for the last 45 years, it hasn't. And there's a whole host of things, and I've gone into it on this channel. But here I want to talk more positively and discuss what I think it needs to do if it wants to have a future. So let's start with this idea. How does jazz open itself up to normal, bottom of the pile, working class people, right? Well, how can it? The first threat against it is that performed music is really under threat. The computers come along, and it's like now most people aren't listening to perform music. So the regular person in the street does not have any sensitivity that much to the idiosyncrasies that you get with a real musician. That is exacerbated by what digital audio workstations can do in terms of live performance. So a lot of jazz albums that are coming out at the moment, they sound too perfect. Everyone's playing too many right notes, and you feel that they've gone through a process which has drained anything out that would sound human and actually sounds accessible to a normal person. So that is one of the things I think we need to look at the production of jazz, and we need to really sell the idea of a live band playing at the same time. Now, I know in a lot of cases they are, but in a lot of cases they're not, especially on the jazz rock and jazz fusion. Now, this is the second point. There's been a history of jazz. It didn't stop in 1962, despite what the sort of young lions in the 1980s put across. I think jazz rock is seen as a blip. You know, it was a blind alley that happened in jazz. This is the mainstream narrative, and then the jazz musicians by the late 70s were turning back to proper jazz. And it is true, Herbie Hancock and Chick Corea and a lot of these musicians had turned back to straight jazz in the 80s. And then you had the young lions emerge, and this idea came of jazz being, and it comes out of the bebop idea, I think, as being a sophisticated, serious music that is highly expressive, and it's almost like classical music, but it's different. It's America's classical music. Now, that was allied with the idea of it being black music. And what that has done, it has allowed funding for experimentation, support of musicians that do not have the support elsewhere, in other words, creative musicians. It has skewed it away from them to a certain elite, an elite of musicians that are celebrating the achievement of jazz. Now, if you park that and then think of what John Lydon said, he points to Miles Davis and he says, look at Bitches Brew. Because what Miles was doing was not following the rules, and the establishment didn't like it. You know, people like Stanley Cowell was saying that he'd sold out. Now, that album has got a half-an-hour track of dense group improvisation, pulling in elements from free jazz, abstract jazz, modal jazz. It's full out. So how could people think that Miles Davis was selling out at that time? Well, the reason is because it had rock beats on it, because it had riffs, because the improvisation wasn't going through changes. He was challenging that 55 years ago, right? Ornette Coleman was challenging that. A whole bunch of musicians challenged this. And the things that they laid down, if you go and listen to hip hop and you look at the history of hip hop and you look at the samples that these people are rapping over, you look at the debt to Gil Scott-Heron and the Lost Poets, you can see that jazz actually, in terms of a form which is created by black musicians, and here I'm going to say, yes, this now, after what jazz has created, jazz enabled black American musicians to express themselves in new ways. We see that in the development of most 20th century popular music forms. What I'm trying to stress is where that comes from, but let's not get into that. I've talked about that. So without a doubt, hip hop and rap is created by black Americans, and not just black Americans, but black Americans that could not access music education so much, or instrumentation. I'm not saying these people are the bottom of the pile. It was more, I think, that they wanted another way of expressing themselves. So they expressed themselves with two turntables and a microphone. as you know, made famous by the Beastie Boys, one of the great hip hop groups. They're almost like the original Dixieland jazz band of hip hop. And there are those who will say that's cultural appropriation, but I think the Beastie Boys brought something to hip hop that was pioneering. They were an incredible group. And I've gone off on a so yeah, 2 turntables on my microphone. You know, DJ Kool Herc combined with, you know, people who are rapping like Gil Scott-Heron, and we've got this form which uses musical structures that have come from jazz and rhythm and blues and funk to create a structure in which the expressiveness is based upon vocalization, rapping, and it is based upon the focus on groove, of rhythm, of polyrhythm, and is improvised. I've worked with a number of rappers, and when you work with rappers, it feels like a jazz group. You know, if you've got a drummer and you've got a bass player and a good freestyle rapper, they can do a gig because there's a language there, like the blues, and it's related to the blues. So when you go back and listen to a lot of those early hip hop albums, what they are doing is they are repackaging jazz and the offshoots of jazz, funk and all that sort of stuff, and other stuff as well. The jazz is in there. So in the early 90s, with people like Guru, things like the Stolen Moments album, and some of the M-bass guys, jazz musicians started to integrate hip-hop into jazz, and it worked perfectly because the language is very similar. We can hear, even in the sort of elite jazz that is emerging now, that sort of breakbeat that comes from hip-hop and dance music, that is in there. A lot of the Young Lions generation, I think, rebel. Rebel's not the word because they're too old to rebel. They're looking for the swing in modern jazz. So those influences are still there, right? But what it isn't is the accessibility for new players that may not be as competent in the language of bebop specifically, but have another thing to add. Now, it's well worth going to check out my interview with Matt Tavares, who was a founder member of Bad Bad Not Good, I think one of the great jazz groups of the modern era, who then went on to be a songwriter and producer for the likes of Taylor Swift, Kendrick Lamar, Post Malone. You can see that line coming through. And in that interview, he says how the jazz press didn't like Bad Bad Not Good because they felt they couldn't play. So the big thing I think we've got to do is we've got to work against this idea of virtuosity. We've got to work against the idea, I think, that jazz musicians, to be a jazz musician, they have to have a language. They've got to be able to play the changes, because that is redundant in the modern world, right? That they have to have lived the life. That's the other thing that I see over and over again, that there's no such thing as a jazz life. What there is a posh kid's life that can afford to go to New York and go to jazz college, pay that, and then leave and support themselves in a career in jazz, right, where they're either getting their funding because they are playing a sort of conservative music that aligns with this idea of black American music, or they are rich enough to just support themselves and have their sort of entourage of wealthy friends and family to come to their gigs and support them in what they're doing. The reason why I push against the idea of the black music label is not because I want to take anything away from black people. It's far from it. It's because I'm aware that in America, the huge amount of black Americans that are at the bottom of the pile because of sort of historic racism, because of a certain attitude towards black Americans that exists there, have no interest or inclination towards jazz. Now, why was Miles Davis doing what he was doing? on Bitches Brew and albums like the one behind me at the moment. Why was he doing that? It's because he didn't want to make music for an elite, a white middle class elite or a black middle class elite. He wanted to talk to the black kids on the streets. So jazz's future at the moment is that the resignation of jazz to being this sort of rarefied classical music, jazz at the Lincoln Center, exploring ideas that go back, nearly 100 years to Duke Ellington, and presenting it in a way which looks very accessible to the middle class elites, to walk into something that seems like a concert hall and sit down and concentrate and appreciate the history of black musicians and what they have brought to the music and all that type of stuff. That is out there so strong, right? With lots of government funding, because the government funding is conservative. They are so worried about funding something that sounds like Ornette Coleman. They are worried about giving funding to anything that speaks to normal people, right? The powers that be that control funding, the powers that be that are responsible of putting money in the hands of people, are putting it based upon identity rather than class. And so what you're getting is a certain elite that is emerging, that are saying, look, you've got to help us because of our identity group. And the money doesn't go to the actual people, right? It doesn't go to the black people in America. It doesn't reach the black people here in the UK. It really doesn't. We need to reach those people, right? Those who pushed against me and said this is our heritage, blah, blah, blah. I agree. It is black people's heritage. But you have to change it so that people, young black people, not even musicians, because how do you get them to pick up a guitar or a saxophone or a trumpet? And is it that they should be picking that up, right? As I talk about this, I feel that the future for jazz is that every aspect of jazz will be packaged up and become a museum piece and be put on the shelf. Now, when I say this, I get pushback from people here that will go, how can you say jazz is dead, or how can you say heavy metal's dead? And they'll list a load of bands that are working, right? Look, making it like classical music means it will be like classical music, right? Modern classical music does not exist without funding. And the funding, again, is funding the educated elite, right? There is no working class classical music, orchestral music. It just doesn't exist, right? You fund the elite to make music which will never make any money. The money is made by the fact that people will turn up and play Mozart or Beethoven or Brahms as though it's a museum piece, i.e. there is a structure there that will try and to respect the composer and deliver it as accurately as the composer intended. Why did Beethoven want it? But I want to put like some hip-hop beats in. Now, I don't think you should really do that. Well, how about we put all the violins through like wah-wah? But now you can't really do that. Why? Because it's not really Beethoven is it anymore. It's not really Duke Ellington. If you don't have these things in here, if you don't know how to build your solo, if you don't know how to play through the changes, if you don't know how to swing, if you don't understand the history, if you don't do all these things, then how can you replicate the museum piece that jazz has become? Now, that is the future for jazz. Once it's a museum piece, certain things will live on because they're funded to live on, right? Because there's a market for it. People will love Billie Holiday and Ella Fitzgerald. They will love Frank Sinatra. And they may hopefully love a little bit of Duke Ellington, but that could well be lost in the commercial want to safeguard the stuff that has made lots of money. Now, that's the case. If somebody's getting up doing some sort of parody of Ella Fitzgerald now, and most old rockers are doing that in some way, Rod Stewart's done this, then that will sell a whole ton of records. We're seeing that now in terms of TikTok stars coming on who are exploring jazz, but they're exploring that commercial Doris Day end of jazz. We've seen that over and over again. Experimental, forward-thinking jazz is non-existent. It's actually non-existent. Now, so the stuff like Louis Armstrong, Charlie Parker, all that type of stuff, same as the classic rock bands, they will live as long as there are people alive that like it, because you know we all discover music in our teens, and in our teens we want to reinvent the wheel, so we go to music which sounds different, that our parents don't like, but by the time we're 21, 22, that is it, we're fixed, and we tend to listen to that all the way through. I know that because I am one of those people, and most of the people watching this channel are that as well, and that music will die with us. Okay, a few years ago I was involved with Robert Plant in creating, and I'd had a very little involvement in it, but I was around, let's just say, well, I was involved in it, in creating the monument to John Bonham that is in Redditch, and it's a wonderful monument. And I can remember going to a meeting with Robert to discuss what that monument was going to be like, because he didn't want it to end up looking like many of the statues to rockers that are around the world that look like Han Solo when he gets put in that thing and put in I've said this as well on the channel, and I can never remember what he is frozen inside. What is it, that black slab? And when I look at these statues to Rory Gallagher or Frank Zappa, it always looks like that, and he didn't want that to happen. And I said, well, why, Robert? And he said, because in 100 years' time, people will walk through the town and they will look at this statue and not know who the hell this person is, because no one will really know what Led Zeppelin is anymore. And I thought, Robert's just said that. And I went away and I thought about it, and I thought, well, will that happen? And I don't know, because kids are still listening to Led Zeppelin, they still love it. But how many kids are still listening to Duke Ellington or Thelonious Monk? It's going to die with us, and then it will be gone. These funding bodies that pander to the elites, certain types of things like jazz at the Lincoln Center might still be there, where very rich people turn up to buy their ticket in their ball gowns and sit down and listen to this wonderful classical music, which will have been created through the vast amount of fundings and propaganda that we've had over the last 40 years about what jazz is, that I have found that if I push against, people get very, very annoyed about. But why am I doing it? I tell you why, because I don't want jazz to die. Now, why don't I want jazz to die? Because I'm a music teacher, because I work with young people, and although I have my middle-aged, grumpy old man view of music, which I certainly have, right? I got no interest in any modern music, really. I just listen to old music. I've said this over and over again. I don't listen to modern music. I'm just old. Right, that's what this channel's about. I am never going to bore you by going on about modern music. The closest you get to that is if I talk about how terrible the Spotify top 10 playlist is. This is what we are, because we're grumpy men. We're not right. The kids like what they like. I am that, but I've also worked with young people, and I've supported them in trying to get their music out there. So then you have to step outside yourself, and you have to listen to the music they like with their ears. And I've done that for years and years and years. And one of the things that I've noticed is kids are still picking up guitars and drums, but the reason they are is different to why we did. We did it because we wanted to annoy our parents. Right, and then we would go to a gig, and we would be on our own at that gig, and all sorts of nastiness was going on at that gig. They were violent, there was drug taking, and there was a lot of, I came up post-punk era, so there was a lot of spitting and all that sort of aggression that went with that. That's what I know as forming a band. There was no youth clubs, there was no music colleges, there was no support. Everyone said you were wasting your time. I was told from year dot that I could never make a living playing the drums, and why would I want to do that? Because it's just, this stupid music of kids, and it won't be there for very long, and all that type of stuff. That's what I was told. Now, people pick up the instrument because they have gone through their parents' record collection, and it's actually the kids who sort of almost want to please their parents because they are bought into this music. Now, they love it. They love this music. I can remember getting a call once from the drum company that I'm endorsed to, and they said, "What drummers? You know, we need to know who the drummers that the kids are listening to." And I said, "I'll tell you who they're listening to: Dave Grohl, John Bonham, and Keith Moon, Phil Collins. These are the drummers they know." And they go, "That can't be true." And I was with a class, and I said to the drummers in that class, "Shout out the drummers you like," and sure, that's the drummers that came back. That is what they're interested in. So that is a chink of light, although it could be that the next generation, not having that generation above them, which is going, "Oh, go check out Dark Side of the Moon," and then them being blown away because it is incredible music, or go and check out Kind of Blue or Bitches Brew, whatever it is. But I used to then walk down the corridors of my college, and all these kids are in, and you know what they were doing in there? They were jamming, they were improvising, they were taking the music they knew, whether it be pop punk or dance music, or maybe it was drill, maybe it was some sort of drum and bass, and they would get in there and incompetently improvise upon this. And within that, there was I felt a whole world of interest and novelty, which I didn't quite get because I was so old, right? They were playing in a certain way, where say things like, my generation were much more sensitive to the blues, right? So, if you play the guitar, you should be able to bend the notes, you should be able to do this, this, and this. And if you're playing jazz, there's a certain language that comes from bebop that you have to adhere to. I've got that in me, but these kids don't necessarily have that. So because if they're a guitarist, the guitarist they're probably listening to is Tim Henson, Polyphia, and there's not much blues there. There's something else there. Now, does jazz want to open its doors up to that? Right? And how does it do that? I tell you at the moment, it's not doing that at all. So for jazz to have a future, it's got to fundamentally change. And that's what I'm arguing for on this channel. So what does it need to do? I'm going to try and now consolidate what I've said here. It needs to stop teaching jazz as though that's the gospel of jazz, when actually what they're teaching are just the cliches that you need to know if you want to sound like pioneering jazz musicians from 70 years ago. That is the idea that needs to get out there, right? Probably the jazz colleges need to be destroyed. That is probably the answer. Destroy all the jazz colleges and kick those musicians out. Or put in lecturers that just aren't old jazz musicians who can no longer make a living playing jazz, so they're going to sit there on big salaries because they've got a name, bringing in people so that they will sit there and be taught what they did before. Okay? I went to art college, and at art college it wasn't like that. The art teachers expected you to be doing something new. And I can remember doing something that was Cue-based influence, and my lecturer went mad at me. Why are you painting in that style? Only like middle-aged men, who paint on a Sunday would paint in that style. You need to find your own voice, blah, blah, blah. That is what needs to be pushed. We've got to get away from the whole jazz education things, and this thing that now exists on YouTube, that whole open studio thing, where they're sat there going, this is how you... If you're a hobbyist and you want to know how to get that sound, great, go and do that. But don't think that that is jazz. It's not jazz, right? That is the cargo cult, superstitious, like going through the sort of ritual that will make you appear like you're playing jazz. Like the cargo cult people on that island that thought that if they made bamboo aeroplanes and did this ritual of driving it over and over again, that the Americans that had landed there with all their chocolate and wristwatches, that they would be able to summon that back somehow. And that's what I see going on in the jazz world. Maybe we can summon it back. Maybe if we all act out like that, maybe if we put the suits on and we act serious, you know, and we pretend we're from the jazz world and we sit there, wait for our solo, and then stand up and go, you know, so if we do that, somehow we will be able to get the gods of jazz to look down and bring it back, you know, the winter of jazz's discontent, you know, will be overturned by our rituals, you know. It's like basically these jazz colleges are it's just a great big Christmas tree dressed up, you know, in the hope, you know, the subconscious hope that's been long forgotten many years ago that was the original intention, to try and woo back the spirit of jazz. But the spirit of jazz has moved on. The true spirit of jazz has moved on. Whatever was stalking the streets of New Orleans in the 1890s is somewhere else now, because that's the spirit of creativity. It's the voice in the outsider's ear that goes up and whispers, you're a contrarian, you like to do something different. There's some people over there you should go and talk to. I know they don't seem like you, but go and listen to them. What are they saying? Join up with them. Don't do what everyone else does. Do something new. How do you see the world? You know, open yourself up and be true to yourself. How do you see the world? How do you express it? You know, go on, create a form of music where you're not stuck to that music score, right? Where it's not straight up and down 12 notes, chromatic notes, not you know, straight 16th note time. You know, get in between the cracks. You know, get in between the cracks and have your own voice. Those are the things that make jazz what it is. Now, those are not being adhered to, you know, and this is the argument that comes when, you know, we challenge the idea of black music, right? I think there's a strong argument that the X factor in jazz is the stuff that's between the cracks. And I think that is perhaps what black Americans did bring to it. That's the X factor. The only problem with that is I think that the musicians that really had that cognitive dissonant dichotomy inside them was the Creoles, which is why so many early jazz musicians are Creoles and not black musicians. Now we get waylaid by the myth of Buddy Bolden, the idea of this guy, you know, it's like this, it's like Robin Hood or, you know, King Arthur. You know, Buddy Bolden's like the King Arthur of jazz. You know, did he even really exist, and what did he do? You know, this big, loud, charismatic black guy that walked around playing the trumpet loud that no one can remember now who was alive. No, I think that jazz is born out of a schism. It's born out of a schism, and within that, and this is so important because you've got to remember, all 20th century popular music and recorded music industry, the whole of that is based upon this schism. And to understand jazz, you have to get into that schism. And I've always felt it's a perfect representation of the sacred and profane through the individual voice of the outsider. And by outsider, I mean any outsider. You could be some gypsy guitarist in a caravan, you know, that has had your hand burnt in a fire, and it's that hand, isn't it? And you can only play with 2 fingers. But you could take this form and you can change the world. You might be the alcoholic, rejected, upper middle class son of a very well-to-do family that has no interest, this is Big Spider bit by the way, has no interest as you as a person or what you want, and you didn't conform to what they expected of you, and you went away and through the guilt of being one of the greatest jazz trumpeters in the history of jazz, drunk yourself to death. Right? Do not demean the creative, the outsider, because everyone who was out there spouting the language of sort of conservative tradition and championing it do not understand that what they are championing was created by people who are iconoclasts who wanted to tear it down. You know, they wanted to tear it down because they have something to express of their individuality, not their belonging to some identity group, because this thing of belonging to identity groups is classism. That's where the problems lie. It's classism. We're a bunch of individuals, right? There will always be that elite, and they will control the narrative. Always. Jazz is the music form that goes against that. I'm a contrarian. I'm an outsider. I don't want the grief of coming on here and saying all the stuff I say, but I'm compelled to say it because I'm exploring the truth. You know why? Because I don't know the truth. I don't actually know what it is. I have to get stuck in and I have to make a statement and see what happens. That is what I am. I've been like it all my life. That is what this YouTube is that I started doing these stupid YouTube videos because it was something to do, and then people started watching them, and I have naturally gone towards using this channel to explore the truth and to explore what beauty is, because I don't know what it is. Nobody does. And those jazz musicians like Sidney Bechet and Jelly Roll Morton, the pioneers of jazz, like King Oliver and Freddie Keppard and Louis Armstrong, you know, all incredible black musicians. You know, it wasn't their blackness that united them. It was their adherence to be able to express themselves as individuals. And the elite will now shout at me, no, they were expressing their black heritage. You do not understand because you're not black. You're not part of this class that we are now championing as being some sort of separate elite within this music. You know, and we are justified in doing that because historically we were the outsiders, right? And now you're coming and saying stuff which challenges the mainstream, which challenges and upsets people. That's not right, because these outsiders have now created a dogma which we know you're betraying what they stood for. And I'm championing what they stood for. I'm championing it. Because if I listen to Thelonious Monk, or if I listen to Charlie Parker, or I listen to Louis Armstrong, I'm listening to different people. Different people. And when I listen to Django Reinhardt, I'm listening to a different person. All right? People will go, yeah, but he's expressing his gypsy heritage. No, he's not. He's playing jazz, and it was so powerful that it has become part of gypsy heritage. You know? And he was doing it with people who weren't gypsies. Stefan Grappelli, the Hot Club of France. That sound has been adopted by gypsy culture. Jazz has been adopted by black people because it's the voice of outsiders. It's like, and this is so important. Get rid of the jazz colleges. Undermine these jazz tuition courses, right? And let people explore what they like in terms of improvised music that is based upon a groove that's got vocalization and explores the cracks between the music, because that's what jazz is, and allow people to do that. Is it possible to do that with computers? I don't know, because I'm not of that generation. Although I came to the fore 20 years ago in this industry, you know, programming computers. That's how old that is. You know, when I was working in the realm of house music, it was so close to jazz, it was incredible. We could release records, dance records, that people would dance to in clubs, that was basically a kicking jazz beat and then a ton of jazz improvisation over the top. Jazz musicians, that exists out there. It won't get classed as jazz because it's not jazz, because jazz would not open itself up to anything but what seems to be highfalutin and elite. Right? I have no problem with elites. I have no problem with jazz being like that. But it will be dead. It will die, and it won't be here anymore. It will become like classical music. And the funding bodies may be able to save certain ensembles that exist in the future that stand up and give us an evening of Ella Fitzgerald or an evening of Duke Ellington, and play it away like classical musicians, where they replicate what those musicians did without understanding the context of why Bubba Riley was going wah wah wah, and why that was important with Duke Ellington and what that said. And what was it? That in that case, that was the human voice. embodied in music. You know, people were shocked. What's that? Is that trumpet? Sounds like someone talking. They're talking to me. What they're saying, I don't know. They're not speaking English. They're talking to me about something else. Who is doing that? It's this black guy in America. It's the voice of this black guy in America. He's telling you what his story. I was listening to Cindy Bechet the other day. He was telling a different story. Oh, I was listening to Lead Belly. He was telling a different story. I was listening to Benny Goodman. He was telling a different story. Well, wasn't Benny Goodman white though? So he wasn't really an outsider. Yeah, but he came from absolute poverty and managed to get a clarinet. And because jazz existed, right, and he was on the wrong side of the tracks, he could play that clarinet and pull himself out of it. Oh, you mean a bit like boxing? Yeah, like boxing. Like boxing is to the working class. You know, jazz is like boxing. Is that why there's so many? Is that why Miles Davis done boxing? Yeah, that's why it is. That's why the great leap forward in jazz rock is when Miles Davis tries to emulate the punches of Jack Johnson. Jack Johnson, the great threat, you know, the great voice against the white establishment, you know, that couldn't take the idea that a black guy could come out and beat up any white guy going. This is what jazz is all is. I do know this, right? But think about it. Think about what I'm saying. It's not about heritage. It's about individuals turning up and standing up like Jack Johnson and putting their dukes up and saying, come on, take me on. That's what jazz needs to do. It needs to get its balls back. It needs to get rid of the jazz colleges, close it all down, right? It needs to get out onto the streets. We need an industry that will support musicians and not support, you know, producers and people who make money. You know, we need the companies to have faith that this thing about opening yourself up to what the young people who are the ones who are going to see the future of what they've got to say. And jazz needs to drop its barriers so it will argue for its legacy, so it will include the stuff that's being created by young people and go, that has the spirit of jazz. Let's open our arms up to this. Let's celebrate that. Let's not got bogged down by who's playing it and whether they've lived a jazz life and what the colour of their skin is or whether they have respect for, you know, the heritage of certain races. Let's just ignore that. Let's just move forward and go, what is going on? You know, and I think, where have I arrived at the end of this? I'm an old guy. I'm interested in music history. I'm a contrarian. I'm interested in exploring what people have missed. That's what I'm trying to do. Maybe our job here is to look at the history of jazz and try and join the dots to see where that lineage lies and be able to point at the things in modern culture that have the spirit of jazz, if not the actual language of old jazz from another time which no longer exists. So maybe what I need to do here, because I'm the only one who can do what I can do, I can't tell you what to do, and I'm talking to myself now as I do these videos. I'm trying to get to some truth that I didn't know when I started by asking questions that nobody wants to ask. You can see that's what I'm doing. You can see it in my eyes as I'm talking. You can see the processing going on. I need to explore not the history of jazz anymore. I need to explore its lineage. I need to look at where it went. Now, all over the world, there are people picking up guitars. And they're picking up the guitars because they've heard heavy metal. This has been going on for years. And because they love heavy metal, they get into a certain thing that heavy metal offers. Now, what heavy metal offers is heaviness. Now, heaviness, I believe, is what people heard when they listened to the original Dixieland Jazz Group. And that's what they also heard when they heard Louis Armstrong's Hot Fives and they heard Count Basie. It was heaviness. It was sex, it was dirt, it was the profane, but it was beautifully balanced against the sacred. Both of those things exist in heavy metal. Most musicians I know, especially here in the UK that would class themselves as jazz musicians, came to jazz through heavy metal. Heavy metal owes a massive allegiance to jazz, but how? And how do we get to that? Well, we only have to go back to where it starts, and it starts with groups like Cream and Jimi Hendrix, and those guys were all jazz musicians. The drum kit is rooted in the history of jazz. The electric guitar was basically created by Charlie Christian. That language comes from him. The virtuosity that we see in modern metal goes straight back to Art Tatum. We have to start to see where these things are allied, and once we know they're there, we need to let those back into the fold. All right, and that needs to be argued, and it will be painful for jazz to do that, because it won't like it, because it suddenly starts to go, well, is that jazz? You know, if you look at, you know, rock music, and you look at the guitar solo on the middle 8, where does that come from? It comes from rhythm and blues, and in rhythm and blues it was the echo of jazz. You know, so we have to realize that that's there, and that's why rock guitarists, when they start learning guitar solos like Sweet Child of Mine, that the guitar solo in Sweet Child of Mine is jazz. And I know that nobody's going to accept that. But look at the way that solo develops. It's an absolute, you know, Slash on that solo develops his solo better than most people coming out of jazz college that are putting jazz albums, which is just a big exposition of their chops and the licks that they've learned for as long as the solo goes on. Yeah, I think I've got to the end now. Yeah, I've got nothing more to say. I've made my point, and it's self-realization. That's what we're all trying to move towards. Anybody who sits there in their morally absolute position, believing that they have the answers and they can turn around and actually treat people like heretics because they dared to question the dogma. I hate that. You could probably tell I hate that. And the reason is because it's anti-art. You may think, why does Andy keep going on about this? I want to get to what creativity is. Art exists. We respond to it, and then we talk about it. And in our discussion of it, we can try and understand how the determination of what is beautiful in the world has changed for culturally what's going on around us. Now, we're in a situation that the crisis that's in creativity in the arts is directly allied to the awfulness that is going on in the world at the moment. Those who have taken up, you know, various sides over the wars that are going on at the moment may have forgotten the utter desolation of fundamentally killing people based upon your ideological position. And artists needs to show how awful that is. I'm not on anybody's side. It just needs to stop, and there's no way of stopping it, right? Because no one has the answers. No one's got the answers. But an artist can paint the pain, because nobody knows the pain. We know the pain of the Holocaust because so many artists have explained it to us. Not historians, not scientists, artists. We know the pain of being, we don't know it, but we can try and understand the pain of being a black slave in America, because so many great artists have portrayed it. And don't say no, us white people can't understand it, right? Because what was the point in this great black art that did explain it and has done it? What was the point in it if it didn't work? It did work. We have an idea, but what's it's like to be a Palestinian at the moment, we don't really have an idea. The artists need to put that across. And the real fundamental reaction that this is not a beautiful thing that's going on, I'm yet to see the art. I don't know where the secret Sassoon is, you know, the First World War poet that explains it in those terms, right? I just haven't seen. I mean, I was looking at a Brazilian photographer that photographed the Rwandan massacre that happened in Africa. Again, where two identity groups decided they didn't like each other and did the only thing that they thought was right, which was to try and destroy the other one so they could create some utopian future by wiping out anybody that's not a part of the group that they have decided needs to exist for the world to be perfect, right? That's always been the problem. And I was looking at these photographs. They are so beautiful. I wish I knew the name of the artist. And so harrowing at the same time. And what it does is it places what happened in almost biblical terms. And what's interesting, especially with the Israeli-Palestinian war, it is framed directly in biblical terms. Aesthetically, we seem to be looking at the end of days. I hope not. But that is an aesthetic idea. It's not a historical, it's not a truth statement, it's an aesthetic statement. Right? Maybe at the fundamental esoteric heart of those two religions that can't stand each other, there is actually the seed inside that will stop what is going on there. And that seed will be humanity. It will be the acceptance of people as all belonging to only one group, and that's human beings. And I think that's what jazz does as well. So when you spot anybody trying to argue the case for a certain group over another group, be suspicious of it. And that is the thing we need to eradicate if we want to save jazz. And it's the thing we need to eradicate if we want to save ourselves. Oh, I've got to a profound point now, aren't I? I'm like Russell Brand, dressed in white with my thing on here. I'm not doing all the, awakening one. I'm not doing all that though, because I'll knock my light. You see, I haven't got the expansive space because I haven't got the funds of Russell Brand. But I was watching him the other day and I thought, he thinks he's Christ, doesn't he? He thinks he's Jesus Christ. Chris Cornell, Jesus Christ pose. We see the Jesus Christ pose all the time. Now, I'm the prophet of jazz. I'm the great white prophet of jazz. I am now totally ruining the fact that I got to something so touchy-feely at the end of my video, where people are sat there going, oh, maybe Andy's right. He's not a bad guy, really. He's not a right-wing racist. He just wants harmony in the world. No, he doesn't. He's using that just to push his right-wing talking points. I hate them. I hate the black people. I want them all in their place. They didn't make jazz. White people make jazz. It came from British brass bands. Monty Python theme, that's jazz. God, I just want to steal it for myself, you see, jazz. That's my evil plan. Is that if I can prize it out of the hands of black people, then I own it. I've been told this. You're just trying to grab what we've created. I am. I'm going to take jazz and I'm going to bring it back to Kidderminster, right? And I'm going to put it in this bin. This is my bin for jazz. I will put it in this bin and then I will put it in the corner. And all the black people in America will be going, where's the jazz gone? I don't know. I think Andy Edwards has got it. Where is it? He's got it in a bin over in Kidderminster. Why has he got it there for? Because he likes it and he wanted to own it. Well, I want to own it. Well, you can't have it. It's my ball and you're not playing. That bit at the end of the video was called a parody. It was satire. I didn't actually mean any of that. Sorry. Some of you will be thinking it's quite funny and some of you will be thinking it's upsetting. I can't please all the people all the time, can I? You can't please all the people all the time. Once you realise that, you realise the secret of life. You know why? Because we're all different. And the only way we can get along is by celebrating our differences. And the people who find what I say upsetting, the problem is I'm talking to you through here, and I wish you could come in here and I can make you a cup of tea and we could shake hands, maybe even have a little bit of a hug and sit down and go, come on, you're watching my channel because there must be something you like about it. And I do appreciate you pushing back against me. But, can't we just put all this aside now and stick some nice jazz on and have a listen, give ourselves a pat on the back and say, look, this is what brings us all together, not what pushes us apart, right? And if I'm saying everything's wrong, I could be completely wrong in what I'm saying. When I have these controversial opinions, I could be completely wrong, right? I'm quite happy, I could be the biggest idiot on the planet. But the thing is I come on here, I talk, and people watch it and they like it, and the subscribers keep going up. What the hell's going on? Maybe it's just this white middle class guy that's just pandering to loads of other white middle class guys and just stoking them up with my right wing talking points. Maybe that's what it is. Maybe that's what's going on here. But the thing is, right, if I look here, right, and I pull an album out, I won't pull that one out. Oh, Billy Cobham. I want a proper jazz album. I want a proper here we go. Oh, there, that'll do. Proper jazz. Look at this here, right? I own that because I love it, right? I love Eric Dolphy. He's the best. George Russell is a great mind, an intellectual giant in Western cultural history. Who else is on this bit? You know, Stephen Swallow. Now, he's a white guy, but I love him. I love Stephen Swallow. I love Don Ellis. Look at these, they're white people and black people playing together in music which is highly sophisticated, and I love it. I want everyone to get along. That's why I own this. That's why I've had it for 30 years. That's why I've kept it. I love this. I love this music, and it might die, but I don't want it to die because I like it. And that is where the motivation's coming from. It's because I love it. It's changed my life. It's been the thing that's directed my decisions. You know, my job, my wife, my kids, all were born because of this thing that I love. Right? That's been created by black people, and it's been created by white people, and it's an incredible thing. It's an incredible thing. Eric Dolphy died too young. He's not here. We all miss him. We lament his passing. He was a giant. He was a giant. You know, he had something to say that nobody else had anything to say. He never got to fully say it. He never got. Where would he be? He's like Jimi Hendrix. What would have happened? These people are taken from us because they fly too high and too fast, like Icarus, and their wings get burnt. They sacrifice themselves to the altar of creativity. They are incredible people, right? Beautiful people. You know, Charlie Mingus said about Eric Dolphy that you know, he knew some great musicians, and some of them are good people, and that Eric Dolphy never did anything bad ever, right? They're almost like saints. Coltrane, Dolphy, they're like saints. I absolutely love them. I've grown up thinking this is the peak. These musicians are the peak, right? They represent something. We can't lose it. We do have to hold on. And if it has to become a museum piece, then let's fight to keep the good stuff. You know, let's fight to keep the good stuff, and let's keep this alive. I don't know. What is the future of jazz? You've got no answer on here. But I have, I think on this one, I have been taken up a little bit by the spirit of jazz, because I didn't know I was going to say any of this. You know, so if there's something in here, it's not me, right? I am just me. My personal experience, my personal history, my personal thing that's led me here talking to you now, right? You're hearing that. And there's going to be truths here that are specific to me. But I'm hoping that I've said something on here that hopefully has tied up where I've been on this journey, which has upset people so much. I feel for the first time I've actually been able to get to a point where I can truly show my respect and love to the incredible black people that changed my life completely, and show respect and thanks for them. And I thank them so much, right? But also to try and explain that because I love it so much, I don't want to see it go the way of Gregorian chant. It's going to, though, isn't it? Things move on. Andy, you're old. That's what they're really seeing. That's why they really respond to these videos, because they're the same age as you. And we are lamenting the passing of our time. And really, we need to be generous and move over for the next generation to come in, and they may forget jazz. Let's hope they won't. It's too important. Jazz is too important. Music's too important. Art is too important. That's the end of the video. If you want to press a like because it helps my channel. If you want to subscribe, then subscribe. You can see some more stuff like this. If you want to help the channel, like and subscribe, but share this, because I do think I've got, you know, I've done so many videos on this and I've felt almost guilty because people are going, oh no, Andy's doing it again. I won't title this in a way that it's seen as like that. This is going to be called, Is There a Future for Jazz? But I do want to get this message out there. And I do want to be a force for good. I don't want to be a negative people. And I really don't want to upset the black people. That's the worst thing I would want to do. I'd never want to do that. So I hope I've redeemed myself a little bit here. And people can see my true intentions. So if you feel that, please share it around and tell everybody about the genius work I'm doing here on this YouTube channel. And if you want to support me in my genius work, you know, as I become the white prophet of jazz, then you can do that by becoming a Patreon, and the link's down below, or you can support me through my YouTube, PayPal, tip jar. End of the video, done. It's a lovely summer's day outside. Right. Do you want to see the sky before we go? Do you want to see some? Come on, let's not finish it here. Right, can you see that? I'm going to turn it around so you see the rest of my studio. Come on, focus, you git. Right, let's put it on the big God, I love this thing now. This makes my studio look bigger, doesn't it? You're going to see a different viewpoint at the end of this video. And shall I hold it that way? Right, and let's go outside. And we will finish the video with a little bit of English pastoral beauty. All right, so here we are. I'll see you on the next video. Like, subscribe, and all that stuff. Bye bye.